Good afternoon, everyone. Let's try that again. And there's some educators here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. My name is Itai Dinour. I get to work at Einhorn Collaborative, which is a family foundation that is interested in how we can help bring together people across lines of difference to address the crisis of connection that our country is navigating. And the work that I get to do focuses on how do we provide young people with the kind of experiences that will provide them with the skills, the motivation, and the disposition to choose to work across lines of difference, to solve problems in their communities, and to take advantage of opportunities that are available. And so we could not be prouder to be connected to this field, connected to these amazing actors, both on the stage today and in the room here today, to advance the goal of more perfect. We believe in many of the goals that more perfect is moving forward, and are excited today to be able to dive in and facilitate a conversation about what's happening in the civic learning space. I'm joined by an esteemed panel of experts who could each do a TED Talk, they could each do a dissertation talk on their topics. We've given them very generous 5 minutes each to answer a few questions. For those in the room, there'll be opportunities for you certainly to follow up with them individually. For those of you joining us online, I encourage you to follow them in the social media ways and to learn about their organizations and what they're writing and what they're putting out into the world, because it's really impressive stuff. Our panelist today is going to help us answer two really important questions. One, what do we actually know about what works in civic learning in the K through 12 education system and in higher education? And two, what do we know about how Americans, parents, young people think about civic education, civic learning, in ways that might help inform the ways in which we, as Americans in the public sector, in the private sector, in philanthropy, can support more young people to have these kind of experiences. Brent, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, definitely. Brent Buchanan, Cygnal, we're an international polling and research firm based in Washington, D.C., and we had the opportunity to conduct a national survey towards the end of September of likely voters with an oversample of Republican primary voters and also K through 12 parents. And the topic was understanding what do they want to see in civic education, how much of it, and would they be willing to expand civic education within the public education system. And one of the things that really sticks out, and I think it's important for us to keep this in mind as we're looking at civic education, is that most people have an unfavorable opinion of where public education as a whole is headed. We asked an open-ended question trying to ascertain what are the emotions that are driving what people feel about civic education, and much of it was conflated with what they feel about public education. So it's difficult for most respondents to separate the two. And I think part of that is because it's not been a huge focus in schools. It doesn't receive the funding that STEM and other things do, which is much of the reason why we conducted this, to help policymakers understand that there is a desire out there. And so as we have the American public, which you can see there's a lot of agreement across the board of the different segments and polarizations. And I'll just make a note that we do a lot of issue work, some of it on hot button issues, some of it on really boring issues. And I would say that this is probably the most positive issue research that I've had the opportunity to do in a long time, where there was agreement by ideology, by partisanship, by income, by stage of life, by age, by education level. And it just shows what a broad base of support civic education has, and the desire for more of it. So as we look at we asked a question about, is it important or unimportant for schools to teach more about civic education? And you can see that any time in survey research, when you're talking about an issue, you're normally looking for something a little bit above 50%. And much of the time, you're happy with the plurality of support for an issue. And so when we start seeing numbers upwards of 80% of people believing that this is important, where you've got Republican primary voters and Democrat primary voters, so the wings of each party look like the rest of the country on a topic. I mean, when is the last time that's happened? In the last 10 years, 20 years, let alone the last few years. And then we asked about, does it need to be emphasized more or emphasized less? So essentially, what is the trade-off? Because if you do more civic education, that means you do less of something else. And in that choice, they believe strongly, upwards of 70%, that it should be emphasized more, and the unspoken being, even if it's at the expense of something else. Then, it's been a tumultuous few years in our country and our world, so we tried to frame it as, compared to the past, because of the last 5 years, should we be focusing on civic education more? And again, this is almost 70% that said yes, this is imperative, especially in light of what we've all gone through as a country and as a world together. And then how do we get about doing this? It needs more funding. And many times when you ask, should something receive more money, at least in the last few years in issue research, it does not poll very well. And you can see here that even Republican primary voters, which are usually pretty fiscal hawk on their positions, even a strong majority of Republican primary voters say, yes, we need to be investing more in civic education. There's also universal belief, because you may hear some policymakers say that, well, this would stifle debate if we're just going to teach people what to think. Well, Americans actually believe that it would actually create more vigorous debate and various points of view. And along with that they would allow students to be exposed to a variety of viewpoints and let them make their own decision about that and be told how to think as opposed to what to think. And again, you're seeing numbers in the 80s here. Then we asked if you would be okay as a parent if your child spent more time on civic education, and across the board it is yes, they support that. And as I mentioned before, parents know that this comes at a trade-off. Then specifically about the Civic Secures Democracy Act, it's bipartisan legislation before Congress right now. You can see that this has majority support. And what's more important to look at is look at the net difference between support and opposition. It's not just that this already reaches a majority on a topic that most people probably don't think about on a daily basis. Voters aren't walking around saying, I wonder when Congress is going to put more money into civic education. So the more they know about it, because you can see there's a very strong desire for more civic education, more time spent on it, that we've got already a very strong net support for this legislation. And that putting things like more addition of African American history into schools, because this is sometimes a pushback, critical race theory, other things that are said, well, civic education will turn into that instead of what maybe I grew up with as civic education. And the American public does not agree with that statement. They see all those things and all those discussions as a net positive. And then I'll close with these 2 points here. Because we look at, okay, well, what's the benefit of civic education? What's the benefit of more civic education? And as we look at, okay, well, how do we as a society progress? How do we spend more time looking at understanding each other better? Well, what's the benefits of that? And a plurality agree that it would make more civic education, would lead to encourage more voluntary military service, and that would also lead to volunteerism in more civil service activities. So there is a takeaway, if you have not grabbed it yet, on the table out here that goes into much more detail on the numbers. But the biggest thing is, this is one of the very first things that I've seen in a long time that everybody can get on the same page, regardless of where they are ideologically, and get behind. And so we have that opportunity before us now.
Wow, thank you, Brent, A, for doing this important research, and B, for synthesizing it so concisely for us to be able to dive in. I'm curious, just one follow-up question for you. Based on the idea that 80% of Americans are interested in this, they think there's a role for the government to support it and to fund it, and we believe it actually can fuel some of the other sustainable democracy goals in terms of later participation in military service and national service and volunteerism. Is there a particular message that resonated most in your questions that you would advise individuals use in their conversations?
That this is a unifying opportunity, that this civic education is something that we can all have a common experience in. And I think the pandemic has actually given us a really good opportunity to say, look, we all just had a common experience together. It was not a positive one, but we had a common experience. And that with civic education, if everybody can have access to that and it can be at the depth that it needs to be and the time and investment with it, that creates a unifying activity for all Americans to have the similar experience.
Yeah, we need more shared experiences for sure. Yuval, I'm curious, what's your reaction to this, and how do you think about this in your broader analysis of the policy environment?
Well, thank you, Itai. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm from the American Enterprise Institute, which is a public policy research institute in Washington. And so I really work in the public policy space. And I want to start exactly where Brent left off, because I think there's, to those of us who've seen the fight for more civic education from the point of view of the policy terrain, there's a kind of mystery at the heart of what we find in these numbers. Because generally speaking, when there's broad public support for anything, you would find politicians falling all over themselves to own it, to take control of it. And there's so few issues now where you find 70% support for anything that you would think this would be very, very popular and appealing to our political leaders. And yet, within the policy terrain, the question of civic learning, civic education is very controversial and divisive. And if the public wants it so much, why is it so controversial and divisive? I think it's worth thinking through that question as a real question, because it points us in a direction that I think is where this field is now headed in a very constructive way. I think one reason why the policymakers who think about this are not enthusiastic in the way the public is has to do with the simple character and shape of our culture war battles at this moment. People look at civic education as a venue for the worst face of the other side to show itself. And so on the left, you find people thinking this will just be a way to advance, jingoism and nationalism in the schools, to tell a story about America that ignores our problems. On the right, you find people saying this will just be a way to advance woke civics, leftist activism, and to tell a story about America that ignores our strengths and achievements. And so rather than think about what could be achieved through civic education, people look at it as here we go. Those people are going to be set loose and we'll see the worst of them. But why is that? And I think the reason why people approach the question that way in the policy space, and why the first thing that policymakers think of is how could the other side use this in a bad way, is that the idea, the concept of civic learning, civic education, has not been concretely enough defined until pretty recently. What I'm excited about now in this space is that that's the work being done. It's the work being done by this very project. And for me, it's why this moment is a moment to really begin to invest in a serious way in civic learning. Because I think what we're starting to see is the formation of a real field, a field that understands the charge of civic learning, the task of civic education, not as belonging to one side of the partisan divide or another, but as a way of forming citizens that understand themselves in a way that looks beyond the divisions we have. A way of helping citizens see that to be a citizen in a free society is neither to be just oppositional and outside activist against everything, nor is it to claim ownership of all the institutions and say this is ours, not yours. It's to see that sometimes you're in the majority, sometimes you're in the minority. You have to take ownership of things, and you have to be a constructive critic. That's what a fuller understanding of the citizen would look like. And that fuller understanding is what civic learning has to convey to the rising generation of Americans. That's the task we have and the reason why we have to engage in that work. I think that there is now, in a way that even a few years ago there really was not, a real field here that understands this as its work and that is beginning to translate that broad understanding into particular measures and metrics, into particular kinds of curriculum, into ways of thinking about K through 12 and about higher ed and about adult learning and lifelong learning, and that it is becoming a reality rather than just an abstraction. Abstractions are scary in our divided time. It is easy to look at them as empty shells and fill them with our worst fears about the other party. But the more that this becomes not an abstraction but a concrete reality, a project to undertake together, the more that I think it is, you'll see the distance close between what the public clearly wants and what policymakers fear this is all about. And so I think that this understanding has to be communicated first to the public, but then also to policymakers, so that people begin to see that we have reached a time when it is, in fact, appropriate and necessary to begin seriously investing in civic learning, when that concept means something. That time is coming now. I think the work we're seeing here is an example of that. And so I think that mystery, that distance, that space between the public desire to see this happen and the policymakers' fear that all it'll be is another culture war battlefield can begin to close with the right kinds of commitments and investments. So for me, it's an exciting moment in this space.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I'm curious, when you were speaking to people in your circle, what's the concrete thing you say of this is what civic learning looks like today?
Well, look, I think that fundamentally, the way that we have to think about what it is citizen formation, right? An American citizen is not a natural artifact. An American citizen is a social achievement. It's something we create by virtue of who we are as a country, but also by virtue of what we teach and learn. And that challenge, how do we create another generation of citizens, and a generation of citizens who can overcome the intense division of this moment and see that their charge is to take ownership of this country in the most constructive possible way, is the work of this field, is the work of civic learning. So I think of it fundamentally as citizen formation, which is so much what we're lacking now. And again, I think there's a desire for that. It's just a matter of getting over the fear that all it would be is another chance for those people to do their thing. And that really means helping people see concretely what's involved.
Yeah, really appreciate that. How is it that we're preparing not just the future generation of young people, but also adults today to thrive in a pluralistic, multiracial, multi-ethnic, constitutional democracy? Thank you. Okay, you are one of the people that I turn to when I have questions about what do we know, what don't we know, how do we move this field forward from a research and knowledge measurement perspective, and I'm curious if you can share some wisdom with our audience today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. My name is Kawashima-Ginsberg. I'm the director of Circle, based at Tufts University. We study civic learning and engagement in broad ways so that young people have multiple pathways to enter life of citizen and lifelong citizenship. So we have been in this game for 20 plus years. We're founded on the idea that we need a cross-disciplinary field of civic learning and engagement so that we can understand what kind of policies might work, what kind of practice can be established in classroom. And that work started with Civic Mission of School, which was published in 2003. And since then, we've studied and partnered with multiple states to try to understand how do we shrink the distance between that vision of citizen formation that's often in the policy's intent and the outcomes that we are or aren't seeing. We do have some knowledge bases about some of these best practices, like academic discourse about current and controversial issues, or how do you build civic reasoning skills, how does direct instruction that's active learning and evidence-based can build civic knowledge, disposition, and even literacy. We have those pockets of promising practices that are starting to build that evidence base. What we haven't done yet is how do we build that model that's scalable yet flexible, that's based on this clearly defined agenda and definition of civic learning that we're starting to achieve as a field, as Yuval said. And that's really the direction that we're starting to go into, is that now we have this strong framework that we can agree on that positions civic learning as the constitutional democracy as content and practice, not either or. And how do we think about the teacher practice, the school and classroom setting, and student engagement more holistically, so that we can achieve that impact in every community in the United States and for every student in that school. So what we're starting to do now, especially through the work through the Educating for American Democracy initiative, which is so aligned with More Perfect initiative, is to really, as a field, start to come together to think about the next phase of how we do research. Part of that is really thinking about what do we know already from the individual studies. So some of that's about synthesizing. The other part is really about starting to really incorporate educators and education leaders in the making of research and policy design. We know, especially in the shifting political landscape of American public education, there's public support, but there's a lot of fear that teachers are seeing in the community. And we can't just let that stop this best practices that we now know exist. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we have task forces. My friend Joe Kahn's over there, who leads the research task force, and I'm moving to really support teacher leadership development and thinking together about how can we have a research agenda that listen to the field of practice, the challenges and opportunities and innovation that can happen from this great framework, and then do the research that's rigorously done so that we can build this framework that's scalable as a model that can build in different communities and different forms and manifestations so that we can finally say there's a clear definition of civic learning. We know how to measure that as a practice and outcome, and we actually know how to scale that in a way that meets different communities, different culture needs, and social studies standards, which is important. So we're really just beginning on that work, but I think it's huge movement for us to really think about how can we be all contribute to that and invest in a longer term future rather than just thinking about 1 year intervention, does it work today? It's more about, can we watch this for 4 years, 5 years, 10 years? Then what are we doing for the future readiness of the young people we have in the community? And we haven't even begun to look at that. So it's really exciting time.
And if individuals in the room, those watching live or recorded, are interested in diving into the research that you're referencing, where would you point them to?
So we are actually just embarking on the work of surfacing everything everybody knows about these best practices. So I just mentioned some of the key practices, like incorporating social studies in kindergarten curriculum actually raises reading score, for instance. So these are kind of things that we know as a research field and community of practice, but not in the format that's digestible to the teachers and to the public and to the parent communities. So we're starting to do that work as a collaborative effort between practitioners and researchers, because we know the knowledge is everywhere. It's not just in academic studies, but we're then trying to inform what's next. What else do we need to study? We do know that we really need to figure out how to measure some of these outcomes more clearly. So some of that is really emerging work. And that's part of the reason why we're looking for investment in those research agenda too. But we're almost there.
That's great. Thank you, Kay.
Thanks.
Carol, you have been a force of getting higher education to really elevate its role in developing young people as civic agents. And I know that one of the recent things you'll be talking about today, something that I was very excited to read about, and my wife, who's a professor, was very excited to read about, helping us really understand what works in higher education. Can you share more?
Sure. First of all, thank you to everyone for bringing all of us together. This is an urgent moment in American society and history, and it's a time when we do need to pull together, and the news that there's bipartisan support for civic learning is an important breakthrough. I'm here representing higher education, and I have both good news and bad news and research to share in 5 minutes, so I will talk quickly and you will be sympathetic with me. So the coalition that I'm part of is formed by educational associations that have worked in this space for a long time. Campus Compact, I believe, is here. American Association of Colleges and Universities, which I used to lead and which is working even harder in that space now that I've retired. The Institute for Democracy at the University of Virginia, the Karsh Institute, but also policy organizations, policy influencers, because part of our analysis is that higher education has worked very hard on the learning side and has research on what works, but has allowed policy to go off in an entirely different direction, so that today policy talks primarily about workforce development with no attention to anything we've just discussed, and in fact is urging a lot of adults to just whip through college, get some skills, not to develop that broader education that builds a well-formed, well-educated citizen. So the good news is that there is a movement, and we have research showing that about roughly half of all college students actually participate in this, in programs that many of you have been responsible for developing and advancing. And there are some institutions and even some states, Massachusetts is one, Maryland's another, Virginia, Utah, where they're expecting all of higher education to commit to civic learning, not just some. But mostly it's optional, mostly it's unequal. The students least likely to participate are those in community colleges. And so even though we have research showing incredible benefits from doing applied civic learning, actually working on civic issues and problems, a lot of students are being left out. And our coalition is coming together, educators and policy influencers, to try to create a community of shared purpose about equitable participation, full participation, and helping everyone reap the benefits, both as individuals, but also that our democracy so urgently needs. So we've just released, you can find this at www.collegeciviclearning.org, collegeciviclearning.org. We've just released a synthesis of good, high-quality research on the benefits for students who do participate in civic learning in higher education. And most of this is coming from things like service learning, community-based research, internships, sometimes global experiences, places where students were actually out in the community doing something for college credit. It wasn't separate from their studies, it was for their college credit. And it turns out that when they do this, they're more likely to complete college. Completion is a huge policy priority. And one of our partners, Complete College America, is in this space asking how can Civic be part of the completion toolkit. We know that it builds civic dispositions. It builds a sense that you can get something done. It builds skills, problem solving, teamwork, collaboration that employers value and reward and promote for. So we know that all these good things are happening, but they're not happening equitably or fully for all students. And we want very much to do two things in this space, and I'll wrap up with this. We are partnering already with iCivics and the PFAD work, but we want to make sure that higher education is recognized as a distinct, influential, important player in this, and that we don't surrender to the notion that it's only K-12. There needs to be an arc of learning from K-12 through college, and there needs to be on-ramps back for all those students. 33 million Americans have some college and no degree. They're counted as non-college, but the fact of the matter is we had a chance to influence their civic learning. We need to reap that chance, and that's part of what we're working on. So we want to work with K-12. We want to have clarity about what is the higher piece of civic learning in the higher education space. How do we think about our role in the world, not just our work in the US? How do students themselves connect civic learning to their studies, their career studies? What are the issues in health, in education, in technology that are important to our democracy that they could be working on? So it's a blended, braided vision of civic learning. And we, above all, need investments that help us see more how this actually works for students, but also how we can better align with K-12 so that students are not repeating in higher education something they already should have done in school.
Thank you. I think that point about the scaffolding, right, and thinking about the journey of a young person starting maybe even before their K through 12, right, what happens in the home, what happens in their K-12 setting, what happens in out-of-school time context, into higher education, the way that feeds into community service, military service, national service. I think that's what More Perfect is trying to do, is think about our democracy in this moment and how we contribute to that. So what I took away so far from the conversation before we go to each of you for a closing thought or comment or word of advice for our audience is it works. It works in K-12, it works in community settings, it works in higher education. It works in ways that fuel that future civic participation and drives other outcomes, that, as you referenced about college completion, knowledge attainment. Americans overwhelmingly support it, and Americans overwhelmingly believe that there's a role for the government to play in resourcing it in a variety of different settings. I'm curious with that knowledge base, what does this coalition need to do going forward to actually deliver on the vision that Bridge and Danielle earlier referenced as we kicked off the session today? And why don't we start with you?
Okay, thank you for asking. I think one of the things that is inherent both in the K-12 work, Danielle talked about inquiry, and in higher education, where we're working now in many different contexts on productive dialogue across difficult difference. We need to lean forward on that. The community needs to know that higher education and K-12 are working together to build those problem-solving, respect for difference capacities that we so urgently need as a democracy. And by leading with something that is clearly connected now to a problem that most Americans perceive to be real, I think we will build political will as well as educational capacity to do this together.
Great. Yuval, take us down the road.
Well, I would very much build on that and just suggest that we need to begin to see this terrain as not another arena for polarized division, but as a tool for addressing and overcoming that polarization and division. And I think getting from here to there will take real work. It is still the case that a lot of people begin from the premise that this is just another thing we're going to fight about. That this just looks like fighting about American history rather than fighting about whatever we were fighting about last week. And the fact is, that's not what this involves. This is a question of how do we talk to each other in ways that don't mean fighting, but that allow us to build something together. And that requires us to think about the roles of our different institutions in new ways. And I think it's a huge opportunity. It's an opportunity in the school, it's an opportunity in the legislature, in the State House, it's an opportunity in every part of our civic life. But to see it less as another headache and more as a new opportunity is really what this moment now begins to make possible.
For me, it comes down to this opportunity of defining civic learning and then having standards and policies passed in the legislature. We have done lots of research on this, and we know that there's no policy that becomes reality by passing it. So it's really about this multi-sector, bipartisan, intergenerational, diverse coalition at the local level that all of you can participate and invest in to really think through that problem solving through disagreement and dialogue and discourse that models that problem solving for the community. And it's, I think, actually true when we have diverse inputs at the design phase from actually different people coming in to make those decisions and producing policies and implementation plan actually has buy-in. Imagine that. Mm-hmm. And when we have that coalition, they'll be there for you when you pass that policy, and they'll be there because they co-own the destiny of that policy. And whenever we've seen something like that work beautifully, that's what happened. It was a diverse coalition that made it work, and I think many of you have a role in that.
Great.
There's a saying that Dave Ramsey has in his company, and that is clarity is kindness. And this is the opportunity to create that clarity, as Yuval was talking about, of what actually does civic education mean. And the reason that we conducted this research, and you only saw about 13 of over 100 slides of that research, was refuting what Yuval was actually saying. The left says this, that the right will use it for this purpose, and the right says that the left will use it for this purpose, and Americans actually don't agree with either of them, that is what civic education actually is. And so it's incumbent on us to educate them. But as we were talking about in the morning session, I deal in numbers. That's all I do all day long is deal in numbers, even though math was my worst subject in school. We can't forget the emotion of all of this, because we as humans make decisions emotionally, process information emotionally, and then go grab logic to justify what we emotionally were driven to do. And so it's taking not just the information from this data, but it is making that emotionally relatable, primarily through nostalgia. Most policymakers are older, most educators are older, and so playing to that understanding of what they felt back when they did civics and when they were in school, and how the country's changed, and how civic education was a tool for them to understand the past and to project toward the future. And that if we're at a moment now where we need more of both of those things, well, what's the tool that allows students and college students and even adults to deal with that? Well, it's civic education.
Please join me in giving a big round of applause to our experts here. I am looking forward to hearing from the educators and the policy leaders and certainly the students who are here with us today, who can build off of what has been shared already. And I'll just pick up something on Brent, your point of, at the end of the day, what we as humans need, or how we are guided by, are our emotions and our relationships. And I'm very excited to continue to be in relationship with all of you and our audience here today, both in person and virtually, to continue to build this field and this work. Thank you very much, everybody.